thank you, everybody. Julie, I don't know if it's raining there at the beach, but it is raining here. So I hope you have better weather than we do. But I will call to order this special meeting, July 21st, 2026. The first order of business for the special meeting will be approval of the agenda for tonight's meeting. I'll entertain a motion to approve and adopt that agenda that Barb circulated. Do I hear a motion to approve the agenda?
I'll make that motion.
Do I hear a
I'll second
second?
it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right.
Aye.
Perfect. Approval of tonight's agenda is unanimous. Thanks, everybody. Next order of business is unfinished business, which will involve further discussion of House Bill. Just for purposes of everyone being able to hear, if you're not speaking, if you could just go on mute, that way everyone can hear the speaker. The next order of business is unfinished business, which will involve further discussion of House Bill 1466, Senate Bill 891, on accessory dwelling units. And for clarity, I just wanted to point out for the record that there are two items to be discussed independently. The first is possible authorization of a contract for a traffic study, which will be needed to codify the requirement of having two off-street parking spots for accessory dwelling units. And for timing purposes, the council will need to vote this evening on whether to authorize or opt out of this traffic study. The second is the rear and side setbacks for these accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, as you'll hear us refer to them as. In the agenda packet for the July 13th council meeting, there was language from a neighboring municipality incorporating increased setbacks for ADUs based on height and length of these structures. So I think it makes sense to delineate these items and discuss them independently. Barb, would you like to help us frame the discussion around this?
Sure. Do you have a preference, Mayor, of which item you want to start with? Do you
Why don't
want
we
to start with
start
this?
with why don't we start with the traffic study, just
Okay.
because that's the way I kind of listed it out there. Thanks, Barb.
Yeah, so I guess just as we talked about at your meeting on the 13th, there is currently a parking requirement in the town code of two parking spaces per dwelling unit. So what that means in practice is that if you have a main structure, it has to have two parking spaces, and if you have an accessory dwelling unit or ADU, it would also need to have two parking spaces as things stand today. With the state legislation that was adopted in 2025, you can only have off-site parking requirements for ADUs now if those parking requirements are supported by a traffic study. And the state law basically does spell out what the elements of that study have to be. So it's the cost to construct off-street parking spaces, whether sufficient curb area exists along the front line of the property to accommodate on-street parking. The study has to factor in the increase in impervious surface if you're requiring off-street parking and how that relates to any applicable stormwater management plans. And basically, you kind of take into some considerations, variability and the size of the lot and things of that nature. So any type of off-street parking requirement will trigger the need to have a traffic study. There was some discussion at your meeting on the 13th about possibly lowering the two spaces that are currently required for all dwelling units and possibly reducing that to one for ADUs. That will still require a traffic study. One thing I would just note is, we're required to get a traffic study. but not all traffic studies are necessarily going to have the findings that you might want them to be. The engineers are going to do the work that they are required to do and to render a professional opinion. So there's always a chance that we would get a traffic study and it might not support off-street parking requirements. So as the mayor mentioned, I did get a proposal from Grove Slade. This is a transportation engineering firm that we do have on a contract with just on an as-needed basis should work arise. A copy of their proposal was provided in your July 13th agenda packet as well as your packet for this evening. And the fee is a fixed fee of $23,000 plus an allowance of $1,000 for reimbursable expenses. So that's sort of the lay of the land. In the recommendation section for this agenda packet, I did reformat things a little bit differently. So hopefully that was helpful. But if you want to have any type of off-street parking requirement for an ADU, we would need to get a traffic study underway and pretty much immediately. In the absence of that, I'm not sure we can hit some of the timing that is required. One thing that didn't come up at the last meeting that I did just want to mention is any change in the parking requirement, whether that's to reduce it to one space or to eliminate it altogether, is considered a building regulation under the state land use article. What that means in practice is that we would have to introduce an ordinance, send it to the county council, because by state law, under the land use article, they do have an opportunity to comment on it. We've had a couple building regulations we've sent to the county council during my almost 5 years with the town. The county council has never weighed in on anything. I mean, sometimes they'll just say we have no comment. But we are required by law to give them that 30-day opportunity. So what that means in practice is that we would have to probably have a special meeting towards the latter part of August. Um, and basically, once the ordinance is introduced, send it to the county council and give them an opportunity to comment on it before it could be adopted.
I'd like to say two things. One is to clarify that that the traffic study would include the parking study, which is required in part of the language that I read this morning. And the second is, I'm wondering if we're making our problem larger by 50% by requiring two parking spaces for an ADU, because all of the ADUs I know of today only have one person living in those units with a car. And if you think about a small ADU as an accessory dwelling unit, are we really shooting ourselves in the foot by requiring two parking spaces for each ADU? Maybe we should just say it needs to be one, and then our parking problem is reduced by 50%.
Piggybacking on that, Barb, can I just ask a clarifying
Sure.
question? If we do not authorize the traffic study,
Mhm.
if we then are essentially eliminating the two parking spaces per ADU requirement. Does that reduce all parking requirements for ADUs, or would it be possible, or is there a scenario where we amend it to one? Or does amending it
Um,
to one still require the traffic study?
it does. So
Okay,
basically what state law is requiring is any off-site parking requirement for an ADU has to be supported and justified by a traffic study.
even if there's an existing policy already in place and it's just a change to that policy.
Yes.
It's not a new, okay, okay,
Yeah, that's
thank you.
that's
But
correct.
just to clarify, the traffic study and parking study would allow us to to include for ADUs on-street parking. Off-street parking would not require a traffic study. Is that correct?
Um, Kind of the reverse. So an off-street parking requirement for an ADU triggers the traffic study.
Right.
If that's eliminated, then essentially what we're saying, it doesn't stop somebody as a property owner from creating off-street parking if they want to. We know some residents who have done that over the years, but
On site, right? On their
right.
property,
Yeah.
right?
But basically it would essentially mean that someone wanting to create an ADU does not have a parking requirement. So presumably if they didn't want to create one voluntarily, then the people residing in the ADU presumably would park on the street.
And that would not require a traffic study. for a
Um,
parking study.
Correct. So I think
Right.
one of the things we talked about at your meeting on the 13th is that you have the option if you don't want to, go with a traffic study. What practically that means is we would need to amend the code to basically limit the requirement of two parking spaces only to the main building on the site. And that would essentially resolve the ADU issue that the state is concerned about.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Just one point to clarify. I think that Lisa brings up a good point. The idea here is that not having a requirement for so on-site and off-street are the same thing, right?
Okay.
It's on-site, meaning it's off the street. Street parking
Correct.
is not controlled by permitting. So if in the event that we do not require that, that does not remove the option. If someone is building an ADU and they want to put a driveway there, we are not removing that option for them. They actually have more options. They still have that option available. Sorry. This in no way limits that. Just to kind of be clear on that one point. Hey, Phil, you're on mute.
Is that actually true? Because don't we have any limits on pervious space, impervious space? The ADU thing basically allows us to, if we've got the proper traffic study would allow us to mandate two parking spots. And I don't know if there's a problem where whoever builds the ADU may have so much lot coverage that they won't be able to include new parking spaces because of impervious surface. Whereas with my understanding of what's going on with this ADU situation is that the ADU would become exempt from it.
Phil, there's a county requirement about the amount of impervious surface someone can have on a lot. I believe, I'm going off memory here, but I think it's like 25%. I don't remember the specific county zoning requirements, but I was in touch with the county inspector at one point because of a property in town, and my recollection, it was 25%. Jerry, it looks like you've got a question.
Yes, so I've been thinking a lot about this and just kind of talking to a few folks about it. I do think that requiring two off-street parking spots for an ADU, in addition to requiring two off-street parking spots for a new single-family dwelling that's the main dwelling. Now, of course, that's only for a scenario where there's going to be a brand new main building built, or maybe one that's substantially renovated or something. I'm not sure what triggers that requirement for two off-street parking spots for the main building. But presumably our current regulation or ordinance is requiring up to 4 parking spots on the property. And that does seem excessive as I thought about it more between the last meeting and this one. However, I still feel that letting that lapse entirely and foregoing the opportunity for the town to set some limits on ADU development without encouraging any development of off-street parking to go with those ADU developments. I do want to encourage ADU developments. I want to say that outright. I think it's something we in Garrett Park can do to increase affordable housing opportunities. These could be rental units. They could provide another source of lower cost housing, and also a way for families to provide lower cost family intergenerational housing, right? So it's a good thing. But I am,
I
as I
agree,
said before,
Jerry. I
yeah,
agree. I
right.
concur.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that. But I'm still very concerned when I look at my own street and some of the streets near me in our small historic neighborhood. We have, for the most part, pretty narrow streets. We have
Mhm.
some curvy streets. We have tight corners. And I am concerned about on-street parking availability. I tried to think about it like at one time we were considering adding a driveway to our current house. Right now we have a little tiny out front because our house is a multi-level. Our house kind of sits on a little mini hill, right? And so when we put in the tiny little circle driveway we have, there was a huge pine tree on our property. So we didn't even have the option of putting in a proper driveway. So we put in the town permitted it and we put in that tiny little circle driveway. But when the tree died on us, unfortunately, so we had to have it removed. We considered putting in a driveway all the way to the back of our house and putting in a garage behind our house. We ultimately didn't do it, but we could have done that and perhaps tried to get a permit for an ADU in that location behind our house. But I was trying to think about, could we actually fit an ADU and have parking for up to 4 cars in front of our house? Maybe we could fit 2 cars in a driveway and maybe one out front comfortably, but we certainly couldn't manage even 2 on-street cars very comfortably and a driveway in front of our house. And I think there are a number of lots that are like that in town. And there are frequently times when on our street, cars are parked right up against Strathmore Avenue, way too close to the corner that shouldn't be. It's very hard to pass on Oxford frequently. So I just think that as a town, we don't have a lot of luxury when it comes to on-street parking. So I guess I'm still in favor of doing a traffic study, but I'd like to propose that we do it more with the concept that we're interested in perhaps requiring up to 1 off-street parking space for ADUs when they're if a detached ADU is developed.
I would support that.
Yeah, if we don't do the traffic study, we forego that opportunity forever because we have to conform with the state law and it's 0. We can only require 0 off-street parking if we don't take this opportunity now to do the traffic study. And to me, we haven't had time to even get public input, and we're forced, unfortunately, because we are the governing body and we are on a tight time frame that the state set for us, we're forced to say it's 0 or a traffic study. And
And
for
the
me,
traffic study may result in the traffic study concluding that the size and shapes of our streets do not comply with on-street parking anyways. So just getting the study doesn't necessarily result in the ability to provide on-street parking for ADUs.
So,
yes, I think that's a fair statement. But
Right.
but it could help us to support a potential ordinance requiring at least 1 off-street parking space for ADUs, which to me does make more sense than 2. I think whenever our ADU legislation was adopted, I don't think everyone fully understood that it might result in when a house is developed in Garrett Park, they might require 4 off-street parking spots to be
Right.
created all at one time. And that could be a lot of impervious space, which I know at the last meeting we all discussed seemed not very attractive in Garrett Park either.
Particularly because a lot of ADUs that I'm aware of only have 1 car anyways.
Yeah, and I think it is entirely possible some ADUs, especially if they start to attract intergenerational families, might attract more than 1 car. But we don't know that.
Right.
But I'd also, when we do consider, if and when we do consider changing our ordinance, perhaps we could put in some incentives for those off-street parkings to be impervious, and we could maybe even make some recommendations for types of impervious parking pads like pavers or gravel or something, maybe even show some models to reduce the amount of impervious space that's being added to our backyards.
But we also might lose some trees in on people's properties to make way for this parking.
That's true. And we could also task the Arboretum Committee. I know they're already thinking about whether they should do some town community outreach about whether any 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 amount of regulation of private tree removal should be considered for Garrett Park. They're still looking at that. So I'm not trying to make that an issue for today, but it is something that we as a council could consider as part of this whole package, let's call it. That if we're encouraging off-street, if we want to encourage at least some off-street parking to support new ADUs, if we did the traffic study, then we might want to look at the whole issue of pervious versus impervious parking facilities and how that affects our trees in town, our shade cover, but also the runoff into Rock Creek.
Chris,
Right.
I think you had something to say.
So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Charlie.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the thoughtful discussion here, and I think Lisa, Gerald, you make great points. Also, Barb, this version of the memo, very clear and helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
I am not in favor of authorizing the traffic study. I've felt as though requiring the two that we currently have is excessive. And I think even requiring one is limiting the ability of Garrett Park homeowners to consider how they might build an ADU. And I frankly, I think first and foremost um, of providing housing to aging loved ones and generational housing. And I just feel as though that requirement for a lot of lots um, would be preventative in a homeowner's ability to build a small accessory dwelling that may be needed, primarily for aging relatives or family. Um, I think there's ways that setbacks can be used to really address sort of how ADUs are developed and sized in Garrett Park and the height and all of these things that, I think my guess is, there would be some alignment on like not wanting massive ADUs all over town that would inherently bring in more people and more cars. So I think there's a way to thoughtfully consider how we might assert some um, um, control over how ADUs are developed in the future. But I just don't, where I said, I just don't think it's necessary or even a very good idea for some of the runoff reasons, some of the tree reasons, but also just restricting the ability of homeowners um, to build ADUs that requiring two and even one is necessary. Um, so
Yeah, Chris. So before Phil, I see your hand. Thank you for doing the hand emoji and following protocol. It's awesome. Chris, before I call on Phil, you spoke with Eric. I believe that you had her thoughts. Did you want to share that with
yes, and
the broader group?
yeah, let me pull up and poor Erica. So yes, she's dealing with some things with her dog right now, sadly. Um, her her position as it was relayed to me, she gave me permission to, if the issue comes down to whether we should do a traffic study for the purpose of ADUs, I am not in favor of that. I do not think this is a threshold issue or need at this time. I think she's would be open to considering some kind of traffic study for other more pressing issues or potentially more broad. But her position as it was relayed to me and the proxy vote, I know we're not talking votes yet, but that she relayed to me was to not authorize.
Thanks, Chris. Councilmember Schulp.
Okay, so I can get my hand away. So let me first start off with one big point. We don't really have any facts in terms of what our parking inventory truly is. And for example, if we just look at, say, there's 366 houses, which could be 366 ADUs. Now, while they may be great for loved ones and others, eventually things change in towns. And so we have to consider part of it as a long-term view. Um, on average, looking at Montgomery County, there's 2 cars per dwelling unit. If I take 2 cars per dwelling unit and I consider we've got 366 ADUs, when you put all that together with a standard Montgomery County parking space, which is 21 feet, that means we need almost 3 miles worth of additional parking on our streets to be able to accommodate these people who will be coming. And we have to think about the fact that some of these people may simply be either transient people who work at, say, NIH or the military, and they've got either their own families or they're a couple. They may be couples who are coming in the area for the first time and they're looking to find somewhere to go, or at least try out the neighborhood, if you will. And when we put all together, 2 cars is not unusual. Now, on top of that, there are some families, mine included, who have more than 1 car. We've got 3 active cars, and we park 2 of them on the driveway or on the street simply because it's kind of hard to park 2 in the driveway and have to keep moving cars around. And then there's the point which George Martin brought up, which is, I don't know, I'll call it scary, which is that people start investing. I mean, right now, there's nothing that stops us or prohibits anybody from building a quadplex, a 4-unit dwelling, because the county allows it. Sure, you'd have to maintain all the lot area coverages and so on and so forth we have for main dwelling. But even if it was a duplex, that would still double the number of cars that we'd have to find parking for. And at this point, I think we really need to get a hand on what our inventory is. I mean, when you start carving out things like, fire zones, narrow streets, narrow areas, and start looking and areas reserved for, say, commuter parking.
School buses.
Yep, school buses that you got to try and get down these streets. I think we really need to look at this thing, even if for nothing else, to get an idea of what we have from inventory. And if at that point, we could determine that maybe we don't want to do any parking off street. But right now, I mean, again, I'm looking at 3 miles. Even if it's 1 car, it'd be a mile and a half. But then you got to consider all the people who don't even have parking spots in this town because they don't simply have driveways. So I am obviously in favor just to get some facts to base our decisions on.
Any other thoughts? I think this is a great debate. I really appreciate it. Looks like Chris and Jerry Lee both have points. Thanks, Phil. Jerry Lee, you want to go first?
Sure. Just to add on to what Phil just pointed out and also to comment on some of Chris's points, I don't think we should do a traffic study just for the purpose of trying to force the requirement of ADU parking. I do think looking at it, shaping the contract a little bit more broadly to get the facts, like Phil said, some data about how much space for off-street parking we have. Are there some streets where perhaps for safety reasons, we might want to limit parking on one side or the other, or at least on parts of the street? And also, it's not all or nothing. The traffic study could help us to get data to decide, do we want to require that ADUs on certain streets would require one off-street parking because those are particularly narrow streets, but other streets where there's just a wider right-of-way and more room wouldn't necessarily have that requirement. So I just think getting the data will help us to make a better decision ultimately. We have to make our decision pretty fast here, no matter what. And I would feel better about the decision if we had some data to support it, as Phil pointed out. Thank you.
Sure.
What I think that's a good point, Jerry, about the scope of the study, and that's one thing that troubles me a little bit. Is it's not a small amount of money, and actually, I mean, it doesn't appear. I think $23,000 was the base number, but the way I interpreted what the information that was provided is it could jump significantly based on number of hours. I don't know if we have a clear idea of how much ultimately that could cost. Maybe I'm wrong, but there's a lot of other
Yeah.
more expansive traffic issues. You know, we've got the Strathmore area sort of by my house, the hill. I realize Strathmore's a state highway, I guess, but I guess one of the concerns I would have is to rush into a traffic study and not be able to take the time to really identify the full scope of what might be needed and what we might want to look at and what are the questions we are trying to get answers to, because of this extremely tight turnaround. I also, I mean, Phil, like your point is well taken, 3 miles. Well, I don't think anyone here would be all that interested in seeing 3 miles of additional um, driveways in Garrett Park or whatever it is, 1.5 miles additional to get us to 3 miles of parking. So I still come back to the idea that the focus really maybe needs to be on how we're going to address ADU development and prevent, to the extent we think it's necessary, major huge ADUs and duplexes, quadplexes, or whatever it may be. Because adding, and maybe it's not going to be concrete, maybe it is, I don't know, but the thought of adding, it seems unrealistic to me that there's any solution that's going to be acceptable to us that is going to add enough parking surface in town. Does that make sense? Like, the focus instead is, well, what do we maybe need to do to limit to whatever degree we can, the number of additional cars, and that might be by addressing the size and scale of ADUs.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, and I think that the point that following up on Chris's point about the additional fees, I was looking at one of the pages where it says tasks to be billed hourly as required, meetings, hearings, and team coordination currently is listed as 0. And I don't know, I don't think that 24,000 that's currently there is the upside. I think that could potentially drift up.
That's how I read it.
Yeah,
I don't know, Barb, if you're,
if I can
yes, please.
interject. So the scope of work was obviously driven by what the state is requiring municipalities to essentially prove, if you will, as part of a traffic study. So the scope of work that is outlined under proposed scope of services, so they outline a series of tasks. All of those are basically encompassed by the $23,000 fee. It's common for any kind of engineering or consulting contract to have reimbursable expenses. Those are documented by receipts. What is not included in the amount is strictly, if there were, I mean, I don't think, quite frankly, the timing's probably going to allow this, but if there was 6 meetings that their consultants were required to attend, that's obviously compensable time. And that's what that is referring to. But the scope of work that is outlined is encompassed by a fixed fee.
Okay, thanks so much. Before I call a motion or entertain a motion to call for a vote and end debate, one of the things when I was a council member that was very helpful and Mayor Keller was very thoughtful. I have no vote at all, nor did Mayor Keller during his time as mayor. I did just want to point out some thoughts that I have. The first is when I was, what we are voting on tonight is the authorization of the study that we have in front of us. The timing as it stands is, I wish there were more time, but the way that the timing is, with the House bill and the Senate bill, we are saying yes or no. We are opting in, or excuse me, we are opting in or we are opting out of the Grove Slade proposal that is in front of us. When I was a council member, I voted against Keller Brothers on Yendel Park only because, and they turned out to do great work, but I voted against it because we had one single bid. We had nothing to kind of compare it to. That is again the case with Grove Slade. Not of there was zero culpability, zero person, people's fault. It's just we are now dealing with a single bid. We have to make a decision on a single bid. I think that the other point that Barb made stuck with me, which is there is a non-zero chance that we will have this study and it will not provide us with the information that we need. Probably not a large probability, but it is not zero. Um, and I just look at it as I like the idea of optionality. I read George Martin's memo very clearly. I am a big believer in data. I think data should drive a lot of the decisions that we make. In this particular instance, I think the 23,000 that is here, for me, does not rise kind of to the level of really, is it going to affect the town? It is going to affect the town. We're still debating on, what that's going to look like. So for me, I think it's challenging to spend the town's money on this with some of the questions that we have remaining. Having said that, I think we've had a great debate. I do want to make sure that we have time to work through the other half of this, right? Which is the rear and side setbacks. And so with that, I'll entertain a motion to call for a vote and end debate on the topic of whether to authorize or opt out of the traffic study put forward by Grove Slade. I hope I'm saying that right.
You
Do
are.
I hear a motion?
I'll make a motion to end debate to authorize the traffic study, in order to authorize the traffic study.
Do I hear a second?
I'll second it.
Okay. Okay, so all in favor of authorizing the traffic study put forward by Grove Slade, say aye, and we may have to go through individually because I know this is going to be a tight vote. Why don't I just go from my screen? Phil, we have an aye. Lisa, where do you
No,
stand?
no.
Lisa's a no. Chris?
No,
And Chris, do you want to just give Erica's vote for the record?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that their proxy votes are not allowed. Members have to
okay.
actually physically be present or virtually
Okay,
present.
okay. Geraldine?
Aye.
Okay, Barb, so we have two ayes and two noes.
You break ties, as you know.
Okay. As you know, for the reasons that I discussed earlier, I am a no on this as well. So Barb, do you want to just kind of walk us through? My understanding is that we are through a vote of the council, which was two votes to two, with the mayor breaking it by a
Right.
no vote, that we have opted out of the traffic study put forward by Grove Slade. Is that correct?
Right. So practically speaking, what this means, and I'll just refer to the recommendations section, we will need to introduce, because we're not doing the traffic study, the timing, well, actually the timing doesn't change, I apologize. We will need to draft an ordinance that essentially removes the parking requirement for structures that are not the main structures on the lot. Um, so that will need to be done basically by late August. So it'll be a fairly simple thing to draft. So we can start working on that.
So that means that an ADU, we will not specify any parking requirement
Correct.
for adding an ADU on the property.
That is correct. Because of that we're not doing a traffic study, we are prohibited by state law to impose any off-street parking requirements on an ADU. So we will basically be preparing an ordinance to amend Chapter 4 of the Town Code It will basically take what is the existing parking requirement and clarify that that parking requirement, I'm sorry, it is chapter 7 actually. It's not in chapter 4 where most of the building regulations are, to essentially state that the parking requirement is only applicable to main buildings.
And that would just keep us in compliance with House Bill, Senate Bill, the Maryland House Bill, Senate
Correct.
Bill that it
So
comes.
we will
Okay.
need to do that by late August. Just as a reminder, that timing is being driven by the fact that we, even though it's obviously moving, it's not imposing a requirement, it's removing one. It is still considered a building regulation under the state land use article. And so the county council has the opportunity to provide comment prior to it being adopted. And we're required to provide that opportunity to comment 30 days before you adopt it.
Does that give us
Um,
enough time if we do mid
Yeah, and actually, I
August to
mean,
late
depending on what
August?
everybody's travel plans are for the summer, you're going to have a special meeting anyway, but to avoid maybe possibly having several special meetings, I'll talk to the
Everybody
town.
loves these special meetings, Barb.
I can
Everybody,
tell.
especially
Um,
Jerry Lee at the beach
yeah, especially on our
I'm
last
in
day.
Maine.
Yeah,
and
Lisa
Lisa
enjoys it
in
too.
Maine.
So I'll play
Yeah.
around with the timing. Like you say, I don't think it's a fairly simple thing for the town attorney to draft. Depending on everyone's schedule, we'll just play around, but there basically just has to be 30 days before your vote to adopt. So depending on everybody's travel schedules, we can either do it in late August, which would then trigger another special meeting, because I mean, if the county council doesn't respond quickly, you may not be able to adopt at your regularly scheduled September meeting. So
Okay.
there's just some
We just
timing
want to make
issues.
sure. Yeah. I just want,
Yeah,
I'll
I'll just go
rely,
ahead and, yeah, I'll ask Ron if he can go ahead and draft it.
please.
And then we can just kind of take it from there.
Thank you, Barb. So the
Hey,
second half of this, I'm
um,
sorry.
Heard
just two
Go
something.
ahead,
quick
Phil.
questions, I hope. The first one is, um, does this mean now that since we haven't authorized a traffic study, that we'll be forever prohibited from being able to require parking spots, or do we have the option of amending it with a traffic study in the future?
That's a good question, Phil. Let me just take a quick look at the law.
My understanding, Barb, just from your expertise that I've been privy to, is that because of the timing of the Maryland Senate Bill,
Yeah,
House Bill, we have until October 1st to do
that's what
this.
it
If we,
appears, Mayor.
we,
Yes.
yeah. So in the future, to answer your question, Phil, we would lose that optionality in the future.
And the second question is, do we have enough time to try and put this out for bid to see if there's a better price we can get?
This was mentioned in both your July 13th memo as well as this one. I did touch base with a colleague who, some municipalities have essentially not have decided not to move forward with traffic studies. I think just weren't prepared to pay the price and roll the dice, if you will. There is a neighboring community that is moving forward with a traffic study by a different firm. There's always going to be some slight differences in scope because each transportation engineering firm is going to approach the goal perhaps in a slightly different way. Um, Kayla looked at these more in depth, and she can certainly, actually, I don't see Kayla right now, weigh in, but we
I'm
did, to the
here
best
if
of
you
our
need me.
ability, try to compare the scope of work between the two firms, and um, Grove Slate's pricing was comparable to what the other firm, it's the traffic group was the other firm being used by a neighboring municipality. So it's not as if Grove Slate's pricing was high. We did look at that. I think it's just if you're a transportation engineering firm trying to satisfy the requirements of the state, you're really having to dig into the unique characteristics of each community, and it means there's a lot of data collection and a lot of on-site type of work, or using maps doing work to do measurements and things of that nature. But
And Barb,
I
one
could,
more
yeah,
question.
sure.
As I understand it, we cannot, if we don't do the traffic study now before October, we cannot pass any changes to our ordinances for regulating off-street parking. So for example, if we wanted to regulate that off-street parking must be pervious versus permeable, would we be able to change that after October, or are we losing that opportunity now?
The state law, it's a good question, Jerry. The state law is fairly specific that it's really about imposing on-site parking requirements on ADUs. I believe you would still retain the ability through a different section of the code. It's really more tied to parking facilities.
Right. So we could do something
Yes,
related to impervious space off
yeah,
street.
correct. I think that's not viewed as, if you, we step back, if the focus of the state legislations we talked about at your regular July meeting, I think is to remove barriers to the creation of ADUs. That's really what this is about. I think if you're trying to provide incentives for people to use pervious materials, I don't see how that has any bearing on imposing a requirement on an ADU. You're just trying to provide an incentive,
Okay, yeah, that
generally
might be,
speaking.
yeah, that might be worth looking at later. Thank you.
Right.
Tara Lee actually brought this up at the as we were finishing up. The idea here is that this neighboring municipality has incorporated an increased setback for the ADUs. I think that just to be very to speak in practical terms, the idea here is that ADUs all come in different shapes and sizes, right? And so currently the setbacks that we have on the rear and the side setbacks are 5 feet. What we had over at Martin's Addition, which is one of our neighboring municipalities, is they incorporated something wherein if the height was above 12 feet, for every foot that it was above 12 feet, there was an additional foot and a half of setback, right? And so we're not going to have any vote this evening, but I think that that to me was an eye opener and a way that we could influence really the character of how these ADUs are potentially added in the future, meaning that if the higher the structure, the more imposing that structure is, the more of a setback that we can impose through an ordinance. So I think that what I'd like to do is in our remaining time is to entertain any thoughts that council members have. And Barb, obviously your expertise is always solicited. I think I heard
And
Kayla.
if
Is
I
it
can
Kayla as well?
just jump in very quickly. So Martin's Additions has introduced the ordinance that's included in your packet. It has not yet been adopted. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank
And
you.
likely what we would need to be doing, and I know, Phil, I believe this is one of the questions you and I talked briefly after the last meeting. I would view whatever setbacks you all wish to impose, don't think about it just on ADUs. They should be applicable to any accessory structure. I did point out, after Phil and I spoke, I did point out to Ron Bold, who is also Martin's Additions Counsel, I believe, that they probably want to change the title of their ordinance, because the idea is that you can certainly, you need to be uniform in the setbacks that you're imposing on accessory structures. You can't specifically, for lack of a better way of describing it, target ADU specifically.
ADUs being subsumed in the broader category of
An
accessory
accessory
units. Okay,
structure, right? So
right.
anything that, if you choose to, amend our current setbacks, or there's interest in that, just view it as any accessory structure rather than limited to ADUs.
Thanks, Barb, for that precision. I want to make sure that I understand that there are no commensurate timing requirements on this. Or does this
There
have,
are.
wait, okay, so that it's the same timing, but we are eliminating the time it would take for the study. So we've got a
Yeah,
little
so
bit
they're
more
two
time.
separate issues and two they're all part of the same legislation, but there's
Mhm.
no study required. What basically the state law basically states is that you can not per, make the setbacks for accessory dwelling units any more strict than those that are established for other accessory buildings. So it's trying to create a level playing field. Um, the discussion that Ron Bolt had with all of his clients is because they're referring to the word established. In his mind, that raises a question whether setbacks can be imposed in the future after the October 1st, 2026 deadline because of this use of the word established in the state law. We are in a
Right.
better position than many municipalities are, because some of them didn't even have setbacks for accessory structures. In fact, we did not have them until an ordinance was passed in June of 2025. I think the question
Yep.
now is, are you comfortable with that 5 feet in perpetuity?
Yeah, and
regardless of the
so
size.
right.
Right.
That's the central issue, Lisa. So
Right.
I would love to entertain a discussion around this, and would love to hear from anyone who's got interest in presenting inputs. Really, the idea here is that if an ADU is gargantuan but it still meets all of the other requirements, we have no, if as it currently stands, that 5 feet is 5 feet for 8 feet and 5 feet for 28
Mhm.
feet. There's no difference. The question is, do we want to instill within our purview some option in which to expand that setback on the rear and the side as these units rise above a certain level? I don't think we have to, on this evening's call, we don't have to come up with anything specific. We can certainly use Martin's edition as a guidepost, but I think we want to use our own. But the question is, do we want to retain some control on increasing those side and rear setbacks above 5 feet if someone comes in and wants to build a huge structure? um I know for me, I think that creates an issue if someone were to come up with a very large structure. I'd love to have some control to be able to have them set back a little bit more. And that's really for the remaining time this evening, I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts. Again, it doesn't have to be specific, 12 feet, a foot and a half. I wouldn't worry about that this evening. It's simply, do we, as a council, do you, members, want to retain some control of what those setbacks look like, or do we want to have it stagnant as 5 feet, irrespective of how high and wide the ADU is? Anyone want to start?
I do. I think we want to continue the conversation and explore what that might look like. I think while giving residents flexibility to do what they might need to do uh, in regards to ADUs, while also balancing that against the prevention of oversized, developer friendly, profit driven ADU development. So yes, on principle, yes, I think we need to think through, talk through, and work through what might make the most sense to control such the wrong word, but address the concerns that I think many would have with ADUs that are outside the scope of what a normal family might do in their backyard.
Thanks, Chris. Jerry.
Pretty much I agree with Chris. I really thought that George Martin provided a very thoughtful framework for us to consider both the Martin's edition and the George Martin um, models. And they're pretty, George was kind of taking the Martin's edition model and then pointing out some other areas for us to consider, like lighting and privacy, etc. So I'm definitely in favor of us taking the time we need to this summer to make sure we can meet that timeline. I'd rather have those extra meetings and get some accessory dwelling or not accessory building regulation updates on the table for consideration in time for us to potentially adopt them by the time that law takes effect.
Thanks, Jerry. I don't see any other hands raised, so I'll just go who's on my screen. Lisa?
I just want to say that I thought George Martin's thought about controlling lighting on other neighboring properties, we should also include in the adoption.
Okay.
That's all.
Phil?
Yeah, I would agree, although I still have a question regarding, so not this one about 75% of the size of the principal dwelling, because I mean, people can use that any way they want. Of course, with any developer, they're going to. And I'll give you an example of one that I could see somebody doing is that you build like an octagon. So I could put four sides, or I mean, six sides on the eight sides. I'm sorry, eight sides on the thing, and basically each 24 feet long, so I don't go over the wall plane length, but yet be able to encompass a huge amount of space, assuming that, for example, I use the footprint as my of the main dwelling. I could go up to 75% of that footprint. So that's one I wanted to check. And the other one, Barb, I know you and I talked about. Ron, I assume obviously must be okay with it, but is this defensible? In other words, by using these ratios, which I'm perfectly fine with. But I just want to make sure that down the road it doesn't get struck down and we have no chance to fix it, if you will.
The issue or the crux of the issue, Phil, that I took away from our conversation and that I discussed with Ron, and I think you see this in the state law that you've been talking about, both tonight and the prior meeting. You know, you can also have very tall structures, and I can think of one in town. Has nothing to do with an ADU. It's just a very tall garage with storage. Um, uh, I think as long as the standards for accessory structures are not limited to ADUs, but are equally and uniformly applied, there doesn't appear to be an issue. And it's clearly what the House bill you've been talking about is specifically saying you cannot have differing setbacks for ADUs than you would have for any other accessory structure. So I think that's sort of the level playing field that needs to be kept in mind.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Any other thoughts before
John,
I?
may I ask a question? Obviously,
Yes.
there's uniform interest in doing something about this. The timing is, admittedly tight. Would the group be comfortable, as kind of a first step, is that I work with George Martin and Ron Bolt to just start putting something together? Because what I want to make sure there's something for you all to look at. So there are still details to be probably worked out that are not addressed in the Martin's edition draft ordinance. I'm just
I
trying to
think
figure out how we
it
move this
seems like if
forward.
George is willing, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, I will certainly ask him. He's always been very generous with his time, but we also don't want to take advantage of that, obviously.
Yeah, I think it would be great to not start from zero, Barb. So I think
Right.
your
Okay.
your thinking around this makes a ton of sense.
I did have
Having
one other
something
point. I'm
for us
sorry.
to look at.
Oh, sorry, John.
No, it's okay, Charlie. I was just to finish my thought, Charlie, and then I'll turn it over to you.
Sure.
I think it makes sense for us to to begin with the framework as opposed to kind of starting from zero. I know that we do have some language that we can use as kind of a base model. Obviously, we want to make derivations from that to the extent that we want to retain flexibility. But I do think having a framework, Barb,
Mhm.
is desirable.
Okay.
Jerry, please. I'm sorry.
Completely agree, John. I just wanted to suggest that we, despite the fact that it's hard over the summer, but actually because it's hard over the summer to have community engagement, especially in the month of August, I think we should put some community communications out, let people know as soon as possible, post our minutes from this meeting or even draft meeting notes from this meeting a little earlier than we might normally, and put some questions out there that we're planning to consider at the special meeting, and also provide notice of the special meeting much earlier than we have been in the past, so that we can allow the community to weigh in a little more. Because I think in the case of tonight's meeting, we didn't provide notice about this meeting. We didn't get the information out to the community about this issue at all. And that's, I'm criticizing myself when I say that, because I wish I had said something earlier about that. I just think that we don't want to go forward to another special meeting without the community understanding, or at least hearing from us what's going on and why we're doing this.
Totally agree. Thank you, Jerry, for
I
mentioning
agree
that.
too. I think it's
Yep.
really important.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for jumping on, folks up and down the Eastern Shoreboard with the beaches. Thank you so much. I know Chris is in the middle of a nonstop conference. Phil, Barb, I think Kayla's on. Thanks everyone. Anyone else who's joined us, greatly appreciate. Oh, and entertain a motion to adjourn. Do I hear a
I'll
motion?
make a motion to adjourn.
Do I hear a
Second.
second? All right, we are officially
Thank you,
adjourned. Thanks
everybody.
everybody. Have a good
Thanks
night.
so
everybody.
much.